2 of the 10 commandments, right, presuppose private property. Obviously, laws against theft. It's hard to, theft doesn't make much sense unless you can own something. And then commandments against coveting your neighbor's goods, right? Both of these commandments imply the need for private property, private ownership. The state doesn't own everything. You do. And, there's all these little bits and pieces, even from the Old Testament, promises in the prophets about every man under his own fig tree and under his own vine in the future state, as if this is going to be the good stuff. This is where we're heading. Well, that sounds like private ownership as well. So that has to be a big one. Sure, there'd be other biblical principles. Greed is bad, right? Mere materialism, consumerism, just wanting stuff for the sake of stuff. Well, that's a principle that would kind of help balance things in the free market. So the point is, well, as Proverbs says, I desire neither to be wealthy nor poor. I mean, they both can have their drawbacks. Yeah. God doesn't mind rich people if they're using their riches for the kingdom.
Yeah, God doesn't mind rich people. Now, I feel like as an atheist, I will admit to not being an expert on this, but I would think, naive reading, that if you say that it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, that does actually imply some level of minding rich people. But perhaps the really advanced biblical scholars could fill us in here that, maybe, we're talking about very tiny camels or extremely large needles.
Well, the scale was different back then, right? Like, weren't humans like really giant? And actually, you'd think the camels would need to be even bigger, but I don't know.
The camels were tiny. Like, the camels were like chihuahuas, and the
needles were huge because they were doing construction with
Goliath had to make us close somehow.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
Yeah. All right. So that's my best guess about how all this fits together. For more on that, though, we are going to be joined at the half hour by Tony Annett, who is going to be a first-time GTA guest, and Matt McManus, who's like the character in The Simpsons who shows up on Kent Brockman's show with I brought my own mic. Since he's here so much,
he's kind of giving that Steve Martin SNL status, where like Steve Martin was never actually one of the like a primetime player on SNL, but basically was. Sorry, I just saw the Saturday Night movie, so fresh in my head.
Nice, I like it. But yeah, so we're going to hear more about that then. But first, we have a few other things to do. One, I do want to mention the book launch that is coming up on October 22nd. So 1 week from tomorrow in Los Angeles. So that's going to be again Tuesday, October 22nd at Lawless Brewing Company in North Hollywood. We are going to have a panel out in the beer garden with me and Ana Kasparian and Jason Myles, possibly other people, God knows. And yeah, so actually we had a graphic of that. I don't know what happened to it, but in any case, that again is coming up next Tuesday, October 22nd. There we go. There's the book, at least the pamphlet. So tickets to this are, it's $5, less if you're a patron, actually. And it comes with a physical copy of the pamphlet. And also, I should say, I know I say this without judgment, that a lot of people in our audience tend to buy tickets to things about 2 hours before they show up. But in this case, I would advise snagging one early because there is a limited number of tickets available. because the publisher of this pamphlet, Everyday Analysis, is not a giant operation. They punch above their weight. They've got, they're just come out with their second Zizek pamphlet. But it is not a giant operation, and they could only send us so many copies for this for the UK. So the number of tickets is actually capped at the number of copies that they were able to send us. So do grab that if you can. Again, the link, if you are in Southern California or thereabouts, feel like coming by. Should be a very good time had by all. So next, I want to say to connect the two subjects, right? So the subject of that pamphlet is the ongoing horrors in the Middle East and sort of larger perspective about, how to think about Zionism and anti-Zionism and all of that stuff. We started by hearing about how the God of the New Testament is actually totally fine with rich people. And we have, for about the same level of cognitive dissonance, we have a little bit from a Yom Kippur service. This is it's kind of the Jewish version of what we started with in the cold open.
Everything Jewish begins with Jewish peoplehood. Kol Yisrael arevin ze bazeh. All Jews are responsible one for the other, the sages taught. And if you do not feel this special bond with other Jews, you're emotionally damaged, Jewishly. The weakening of these bonds is my central concern regarding the future of the American Jewish community. Now I say to all of our young people, not only you who are with us, but those who may perhaps watch this online at some point, I love your generation. I think you're amazing. You're our future. As your teachers, educators, rabbis, and moral guides, know that we tried to instill in you a sense of justice, righteousness, virtue, honor, rectitude, honesty, and decency for all people. We are proud when your generation is active in pursuance of these values. And if these ideals lead you to be critics of Israeli policies or the American Jewish community, so be it. What we did not intend is for your generation to turn your backs on our people. We wanted you to be Zionists. We did not intend that our emphasis on tikkun olam, social repair, would lead some Jews to join anti-Israel demonstrations. We did not intend for American Jews to lead Passover Seders in so-called liberated zones, liberated from Zionists, that violate not only university policies, but threaten the safety of Jewish students. We did not intend to encourage or excuse Jews who burn American flags, or support those who do. The supreme leader of Iran sent messages of support and thanks to student protesters. That tells you everything you need to know. While America often falls short of its ideals, still, our values and aspirations are far better than our enemies, and we are blessed to live in this country. We did not intend to strip all Jewish solidarity, empathy, responsibility, and mutuality from the Jewish identity of so many young American Jews, not only towards Israeli civilians, but soldiers your age who exhibit the most astonishing courage and remarkable self-sacrifice, many of whom have laid down their lives protecting our people in fates of enormous heroism. We thought that we were conveying the principles of Jewish universalism. We thought we were instilling in our young people our yearnings for peace and justice and righteousness and truth. We did not expect the Jewish spirit to dribble away while we thought we were passing it on.
Yeah, there is a lot that you could say about this, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But you know, the overall thing here I love, right, is that this guy is very clear about the fact that a great many young American Jews support the protests against Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, and that B, in many cases they do so precisely because of what they understand to be Jewish values of the sort that he's preached in the past, but he's still very upset. Not like this. We didn't want you to draw this conclusion.
Yeah, and I think I don't know. There's just coming from a Jewish background. There's so many places to dive in that it would almost be worth a full episode. But this is the Goyim episode, right? You guys are doing like Catholicism, and so we can't dive in. But I think it is interesting though, because I think I don't know. I'd be interested what the background of a lot of anti-Zionist Jews like myself are. I think a lot of us probably. I mean, there are those red diaper leftist Jews, right? But a majority of Jews probably come from liberal households, right? So I think it would be American Jews, I'm saying, probably come from liberal households. And I think for a lot of us, we probably grew up with strong capital D Democratic parents who still preached against certain isms, right? Like racism or nationalism or, never again and that kind of thing. And then, like he said, I did feel a little seen when he was like, you're kind of taking what we said and taking the ball and run with it, but not
not the way we want it.
Yeah, no, we didn't want that. We're not like that. And then, I like how when it switches to Israel, all logic breaks down. And it's just like, it's our enemies. That's or Iran, it's our enemies, right? It's us versus them.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up the thing about Iran, because this is about the closest he gets in that entire clip that's been going around, which was, I believe the clip he selected, right, for the sermon to, go on social media. That's about the closest he gets in that clip to any sort of argument that, the young American Jews who go to anti-war protests, who, lead Passover seders and encampments, all that stuff, that they're actually wrong, right, as opposed to just sort of disloyal. And they, so his one and only reason he gives to think that they're wrong is, the supreme leader of Iran, said like something positive about it. But it's like, well, hold on though. Let's really linger on the logic there. Cause I'm sure that you can find examples of like Brezhnev, when he was the to the Soviet Union, saying positive things about anti-apartheid demonstrators in the United States, right? I mean, that's like, does that mean they were wrong?
What's the fallacy there? is it? I'm not even.
Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe the genetic fallacy. It's so that there's a that the person who's, or not even that, right? I mean, just kind of basic ad hominem, right? That in the actual sense, not like, not the way that people misuse that phrase on the internet, which is just saying something mean, right? But,
right.
But like in the technical sense of taking a irrelevant negative thing about the person saying something as a reason to think that they're wrong, right? Like, and it's like, look, I mean, I don't think Brezhnev praising anti-apartheid protesters would mean that anti-apartheid protesters in the 80s were wrong. I don't think that like Ronald Reagan praising like, dissidents in Eastern Europe who were calling for free speech and, open elections meant that those guys were wrong, right? Like, I think you actually have to look at the cause itself and not whether, the rivals or opponents of any given country, are going to then, praise dissidents within that country for their own reasons, or also maybe even for entirely legitimate reasons, right? Like, I actually, there are many things about Iran's system that, I would disapprove of as a secularist and a democratic socialist, but like also, I think that the fact that, presumably the Iranians are worried that this is going to spill over into some really devastating attack on their country, I think that's a very legitimate thing for them to, to be concerned about. So, it's just a crazy argument on his face. I mean, it should take very little thinking about what he's saying to realize what's wrong with that, right? That some world leader we don't like praises something, therefore the thing that he's praising must be bad. And if you take that out, then it's like, well, what do we have left, right? Okay, we want you to side with Jewish people because they're Jewish. It's like, well, okay, but that's maybe you should have cleared that up in those earlier sermons when you were, praising, justice and compassion and, and every human being, having the sort of dignity of being made in the image of God and all that stuff, right? That's like, oh, no, unless the bad things are being done by people who are themselves Jewish, in which case it's cool.
Well, he used the adverb Jewishly, which I had never heard. So I think definitionally, the anti-Zionist.
There's Jake's MFA.
They're actually, this is more me teaching sixth graders. But to be honest with you, I learned way more about grammar than I ever know. But anyway, I was saying that's definitionally, he's just saying, well, they're acting un-Jewishly. So it's total us versus them, and that's basically it. That's all they really have for us. And I think when you see, like the clips that came out today, right, of like people in a hospital being burned alive, and it's like just total fucking contempt for the people. Even if you think they're wrong, like why would you have anger and contempt for people who are like, maybe we shouldn't do that. That's just really astonishing to me. It doesn't. If the person condemning the war victim on an IV being burnt to a crisp is wrong, then they're probably wrong for some really fucking complicated reason, not just like pure evil. You know what I mean? It's really backward.
No, exactly. Actually, so I'll just do this as a screen share because I wasn't planning on doing it, but I saw this clip yesterday of Yeshua Leibowitz, who was he's been dead for a good number of years now. You can tell, the clip we're going to watch is from 1992, and he's very old in the clip, right? But he's this Orthodox Jewish Israeli philosopher who is being interviewed on Israeli TV, and in 1992, on the occasion, as I said, you can tell he's extremely old in 1992, but he's being given the occasion is his being given this kind of lifetime achievement award by, in fact, the Israeli state. And it's been brought up that he's said that like there are certain circles in Israeli politics who have what he calls a fascist mentality. He actually uses the phrase Judeo-Nazi, and it does, in the light of this kind of thing you're talking about here, it does make really interesting viewing.
ובמצב הזה שבו אתה מקבל מהממשלה הזאת שכבר הזכרתי שאתה קראת לה ממשלת המדינה היהודו-נאצית, כשאתה מקבל ממנה את הפרס הזה, האם אתה עדיין סבור, כפי שאמרת פה בתוכניתנו לפני זמן קצר, שזו מדינה בלתי דמוקרטית?
יש שני דברים בדבר. הדבר הראשון, שמאחר שאתה העלית אותו, אני צריך להתייחס אליו, אף שמעולם לא מצאתי לנחוץ להתייחס אליו. כאילו אני אמרתי, מדינה נאצית. יודו נאצית. יודו נאצי, השתמשתי בו בקשר למנטליות מסוימת הקיימת בחוגים מסוימים. יש מנטליות יודו-נאצית בחוגים מסוימים.
היית חוזרת בך מהביטוי הזה לכבוד האווירה הנינוחה של הפרס?
המנטליות היודו-נאצית בחוגים מסוימים קיימת ועומדת.
יהודים ששורפים ערבים להנאתם, כמה מיליוני ערבים, פרופסור ליבוביץ', נכון? חוגים מסוימים ששאיפתם היא להקים מחנות ריכוז ולשרוף בקרמטוריום ערבים.
ידוע לי שמדינת ישראל מחזיקה במחנות ריכוז הרבה אלפים ערבים.
ומדי פעם מכניסה אותם לתאי גזים ואחר כך שורפת אותם.
אני יודע שמדינת ישראל מחזיקה במחנות ריכוז הרבה אלפים ערבים.
ואחר כך שורפת אותם. ומכניסה אותם לתאי גזים. פרופסור ליבוביץ', אתה מאשים את עם...
אני יודע שמדינת ישראל מחזיקה במחנות ריכוז כמה אלפים ערבים.
ואחר כך שורפת אותם. ומכניסה אותם לתאי גזים.
זה נבואתך. זה נבואת העתיד שלך. זה נבואת...
Yeah, so if you're listening to this later as a podcast, so you missed the subtitles and you're not fluent in Hebrew. In this interview on Israeli TV in 1992, Professor Leibowitz is being confronted with statements that he has made about some circles of Israeli politics having what he calls this Judeo-Nazi mentality, and he says, well, isn't this ironic? You're getting this prize from the Israeli government and you said this, and will you take it back? And he says, no, I was right. And they say, well, but there's no there's no crematorium, there's no gas chambers, like how can you use this analogy about the Nazis? And there's, in fact, one of the guys who's grilling him is actually the father of a Israeli politician who's now in Netanyahu's government. Gives a little extra layer to this, but they go back and forth about it, and the guy keeps pushing. It's like, hey, come on, there's no there's no equivalent to the Holocaust. How can you say this? And then Leibowitz ends up, basically yelling at him, when he starts saying, oh, well, but gas chambers, no gas chambers. He says, well, that is your future prophecy. In other words, the oppression of the Palestinians hasn't escalated to genocide yet, right? Doesn't mean it never will. I'm not the first or 100th person, I think, to point this out, but it's this clip like really registers differently after seeing those images, right, of the patients burning alive in the hospital, all while on the IV. That again, the kind of thing that that Leibowitz was saying that this level of dehumanization could lead to. I think we've seen, right? So I don't want to. I want to switch to the Goyish section of the show very soon, but
I do just want to throw out a Philip K. Dick quote that I absolutely love. Is to defeat the empire is to take on its madness, and those words are certainly very true. So, yeah, fair enough. Okay, well, we have we have one of the at least compared to the rabbi, young Jews who he was expressing such disappointment in, Andrew Garfield.
Yeah, and after, well, actually, never mind. I don't want to make any jokes about him because he's really on my good side. But let's just say he looks really young these days. Man is over 40. Sometimes there's a little bit of magic in Hollywood, and some of these people look like 25. But yeah, let's watch the clip.
But I want to help you, buddy. What do you want? What can this 500 people collectively clap our hands and make happen for you?
Oh man, I don't know. I'm pretty, you know what, like out of everyone in the world, I'm so happy. Like we should be putting our energy towards something that actually matters.
What could be more important than that right now?
Yeah, maybe the lives of, I don't know, Palestinians in Gaza right now. Maybe that's where we put our hearts and our energy, and anyone suffering, anyone oppressed, anyone that is suffering under the weight of the horrors of our world right now, anyone who doesn't have a choice in you know, living lives of dignity. That's where our energy should be going right now.
Is there
Well said. Take it from I'll be sea level Andrew Garfield. Somehow man looks younger than me. He has like 10 years on me. But you know, we put forth our best Jew before going to the Goy section. He's one of the best. He's one of the best representatives right now.
Fair enough. Okay. So we do have a bunch more on this subject. You know, Bill Maher said some really stupid shit. People will be shocked to hear. We have people mad at Ta-Nehisi Coates for saying that he you know, he isn't confident in his own moral fortitude. You know, we've got quite a bit along these lines, but the rest of this, I think, is going to have to wait for the post game for patrons, and I will also see Jake and Andy then. Meanwhile, let's bring on the man, the myth, the political science professor, Matthew McManus.
Hey guys.
And Tony Annett.
How are you? Good to see you all.
Hey Tony.
Yeah.
So yeah, thought this would be interesting. As I said, as we move into the Goyish section of the program, and for the, you know, the Christianity half, because this is something that both of you have written extensively about. Tony, who is here for the first time, wrote one article called Social Democracy Needs Catholicism, another one called The Theology of Social Democracy, several others, I think, along the same lines. And Matt, who needs no introduction on this show, has written a bunch about specific Christian thinkers and you know, and kind of what the left can get from engaging with them. So we have you know, we called the episode The Catholic Left, in parentheses, and some Protestants. So the Socialist Politics and Theology of Paul Tillich. Got The Left Should Take Alasdair MacIntyre Seriously. The Curious Modernism of Charles Taylor. And so I want to get into all of that. I mean, I guess one way into this, right, is to think. So I think about our late friend Michael Brooks's book Against the Web, in the final chunk of that book on cosmopolitan socialism, which I know, you know, from many conversations was the part that was the most important to him. He, and which, you know, Matt has written extensively about, he wrote a whole book about, you know, he talks about this sort of theme about how to think about cosmopolitanism, where it says that, it's not that, you have to have everybody sort of making the same arguments from the same themes. It's that rather, if the kind of values that are important to motivating a left project are genuinely universal, you should be able to express them in the argot of any particular, cultural or religious tradition, right? That any sort of vast, resource like a whole culture or world religion, is going to contain resources for making these kinds of arguments. So Matt, I mean, maybe let's start with you before we get into some of these like specific thinkers. How would you think about the relationship between Christianity and socialism, and like why is this the sort of thing that people should take an interest in? I mean, kind of maybe regardless of their own sort of religious views or background.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into that, far more important point to note is that it is Canadian Thanksgiving, and I want to send a shout out to J. Andrew World for remembering that, because so few people do. Most important day of the entire year in some respects, and yet so often forgotten. So thank you.
Yeah, got a few more weeks till real Thanksgiving, so nobody's going to notice. But yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. But anyway, on to the less important things. I think there's an awful lot to be said about this, and probably will be said about it in the course of the conversation. But really what I think should intellectually prompt our analyses of the subject matters is we want to get away from this kind of reductive, vulgar idea that religion is just inherently a force for a reaction. Now, there is no denying that there are many religious forces out there that do align themselves very transparently with the forces of reaction and conservatism and capital, or Baal or Mammon, or whoever you want to call it. And those should be rightly criticized and have been very, very fiercely criticized by many on the left. But there are many other religious traditions, not just in Christianity, but Judaism and Islam as well, that are much more focused on achieving what we might broadly call social justice, which has been understood invariably in left-wing ways, looking after the poor, looking after the needy, recognizing that it's to the meek that the kingdom of heaven will go. And what I wanted to do in my work, both politically, and I should say also for my own spiritual edification, was to look more deeply into some of these subject matters. And I guess I'll just end by saying that there's this kind of crude version of vulgar Marxism that only remembers the one line that Marx has about religion being the opiate of the masses. What's consistently forgotten, of course, is that he adds to that religion is the heart of a heartless world. And as long as you do not answer not only the material but the spiritual needs of people, I would venture that you're going to get very vulgar, very crass forms of religion. And what we need to do in order to elevate religion to the kind of spiritual medium that it should be isn't just to try to encourage people to think more spiritually about themselves and their communities, but also to ask themselves how to create a more just world in the image of God.
Tony, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, Matt mentioned the kind of their reactionary spirit of some religious dimensions of Christianity, and certainly Catholic social teaching, which is what I have worked a lot on, was kind of born out of this reactionary spirit. You had the French Revolution and the church aligning itself with the forces of reaction. You had the revolutions of 1848, church not very happy. Then you had the worst thing of all. You had the reunification, the unification of Italy, which meant that Pope Pius IX lost his temporal power. And he threw a little hissy fit and basically condemned all aspects of liberalism and democracy and everything that goes with it. So that was kind of the height of the church's embrace of reaction. But then something kind of remarkable happened. Pius IX's successor was Leo XIII, who himself was a very conservative man. But he wrote this document from 1893 called Rerum Novarum, Capital and Labor, which basically broke open the social question of the Industrial Revolution in the language of Catholic social teaching. And that was the first of many papal documents that goes all the way down to Pope Francis in the modern day. But, you know, these documents are kind of radical. They talk about the priority of labor over capital, the rights of workers to join unions and bargain collectively, and the duty of the state to look after the poor and the wage earner as opposed to the rich. So, you know, there's this, again, this is very deeply rooted, deeply entrenched tradition in Catholic social teaching that has a very left-leaning, I would say, social democratic impulse.
Yeah, so I want to get into that, and you know, I think that you know, maybe one way into this, Jake, if we have the video clip, so we found. I think Andy likes to do these you know, dumpster dives through the depths of Rumble, where he finds stuff like this, and he found a video of somebody arguing that any sort of you know, redistribution of wealth at all, right, you know, should be a problem on Christian grounds. Do we have that?
I am going to go with the working assumption that at least the moral law in the Old Testament has binding power on the conscience of the believer. And the most basic form of the moral law of the Old Testament are the 10 Commandments. The 8th commandment says, you shall not steal. You can find the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. It's really simple. And it doesn't leave any wiggle room to say it's okay in certain circumstances. The simple point here is, I cannot enter my neighbor's house. Let's say my neighbor has a TV in every bedroom and he has 4 bedrooms. I can't enter my neighbor's house and steal one of his TVs and take it down the road to the person who's poor, who doesn't have a TV at all. I don't know a single Christian who would deem such behavior to be okay. It's plain and simple to see that this is stealing. Essentially, what the state does is take from you and give to somebody else. If you think about it quietly, the state takes from one person, from a group of people. Well, actually, it takes from everybody, but it takes from people to varying different degrees. It takes from some and gives to others. The motives behind the state taking and giving to the poor might be benevolent. I'm not questioning that at this moment. But it is also undeniable that my motive behind taking the TV from my neighbor and giving it to the poor person could just as well be benevolent. The issue here is not one of motive. The issue here is one of principle. The advocate of socialism has to deal with the problem of theft by the state. I have so far never heard a reasonable argument that sufficiently deals with this problem in relation to the biblical command, you shall not steal.
Yeah, so there you have it. He's never heard a sufficient argument that I guess you can be a Christian without being a deontic libertarian.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another thing that we learned in Bible camp very early on, right? You know, you read the Bible and then you read Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and that's all you really needed.
Yes, I've run into people like this in the past, these Catholic libertarians, and I have a number of ways of responding to that. I would go back to the very beginning and talk about how the Old Testament, which he referred to, treats private property. It says very clearly that private property is not absolute. In fact, if you look at the Jubilee not only forgives debts, but the Jubilee says all land sales that have taken place over the past 50 years have to revert to their original owner, because private property is not absolute. So of course, this kind of Christian principle was taken up by the church fathers. It was taken up in a very sophisticated manner by Thomas Aquinas, who distinguished between private ownership and common use. He basically said that private ownership of property is valid, but, and here's the big but, it has to be in the service of common use. In other words, everybody has to be able to use those resources. So the terms that Pope Francis would use, he would say private property is not a primary natural right, it's a secondary natural right. Pope John Paul II says private property comes always with a social mortgage. This is called the principle of the universal destination of goods, the idea that the goods of the earth and human labor are destined for all people, every single person in the world. And if private property is not oriented towards the universal destination, then it's not valid. And that's a very consistent principle in Christianity. It's kind of radical, but it's basically there. And what it does is, and Aquinas was very clear about this, it basically gives the poor rights against the rich.
Yeah, Matt, is there anything you want to throw in here?
Oh, I was just waiting for you to say something. No, I agree with a lot of what Tony said there, right? I mean, the simplest way to rebut that is by saying that if the state takes something from someone because it declares that it's no longer their property, then from a legal standpoint, it no longer is their property. Now, from any good Christian perspective, we could ask ourselves whether this positive reformulation of the law or this positive articulation of the law is in fact just, and whether or not it serves the common good. And if it's not just and it doesn't serve the common good, then obviously it can be rejected or even resisted in some circumstances. But this kind of deontic supposition that private property exists outside the state and is only interfered with by the state has really no basis in biblical scripture, and of course no basis in history whatsoever. It's really very much the only thing it's really very much the kind of thing that only a libertarian could dream up. This kind of ahistorical, bizarre world where property pre-exists the law and yet somehow needs to be consecrated through the law and backed up by force. And it really should be rejected as the absurdity that it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have a couple of ways you could go here. So one is basically what you just said, which is the sort of, the Brunigish objection to this, which is to say, well, look, if you say you can't take somebody's property, then the all of the question is, what do you mean by that, right? Like what constitutes their property, and if it's legally what if you're talking about what's legally somebody's property, then this kind of doesn't work as an objection to any sort of redistribution that happens through the state, because then anything that's taxed or nationalized through an act of government is no longer legally your property. And again, I would point out that there's something especially strange about taxation as theft from a Christian perspective, given that one of the few very clear political teachings of the New Testament is that you should pay your taxes. That's to pay for legions to occupy your country. Never mind, for like a welfare state that could benefit. But then if you say, well, okay, but I don't mean legally, I mean like what's morally you have a right to, then that just pushes the question back, right? Because it's like, okay, well, what's your substantive moral theory of entitlement to property? And that's very not obvious. I mean, you can have a sort of lock-in view that anything you've mixed your liquor with, you therefore have eternal property rights to, but or part with by a process of Nozick's capitalistic acts between consenting adults. But it does seem like a bit much to read Locke and Nozick into the Bible, especially given the clear endorsement of taxation, especially given Tony mentioned the Jubilee and and periodic enforced redistributions there. I've been reading this book, the David Lee Williams, The Greatest of All Plagues.
I just finished that. It's really good.
Yeah, it is very good. I'm on, should the editor who commissioned the review be watching this, I'm like 10 pages from the end right now. But
you're not shirking your duties there, Ben. It's like, you should be reading that, but instead you're here chatting with us.
Yeah, exactly. But he makes in the New Testament chapter of that, he makes great hay of this, this point about the Jubilee, so which again suggests certainly something well short of absolutist libertarian property rights. But then again, there's also a question of, okay, if you have in mind some sort of substantive, not merely legal theory of entitlement to property, then now what we're talking about is who is morally entitled to what property, which one makes the theft objection circular, because now you're essentially saying that it's wrong to redistribute wealth because the people you're redistributing from have a right to it, which seems like the same thing said twice with because in the middle. And two, if you
what's that line in the Wizard of Oz, like because like Robert Nozick says it does, that kind of thing,
Yeah, right. And like if you are assuming a substantive theory of moral entitlement to property, and we're not just reading John Locke back into the Bible, then it seems reasonable to think that what counts as a morally justifiable scheme for distribution of property has something to do with the ability of everybody to live a flourishing life, which is presumably, I know much less certainly about this than Tony does, but I mean presumably is something like what's in the background of that Pope Francis line about thinking of property as a secondary a natural right rather than a sort of first order one.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to say to that is I think that there are a lot of different views on the right way to understand property within the Christian tradition, obviously, right? Some of which have more libertarian connotations than others. But I think it's worth asking yourself how a kind of left Christian would understand property and the proper distribution of property. So I'll just kind of run through a few different figures that I think are significant in this respect.
Yeah, please.
I guess I'll go from older to newer. How about that, right? Just to kind of cite my 3 articles, because people can already look them up when they want. Let's take Paul Tillich, for example, right? Tony probably has a few problems with Tillich's Protestantism and existentialism from a theological standpoint. No problem with that. But what I'd recommend that people read is his really fantastic book, The Socialist Decision. So The Socialist Decision was written as a polemic against Nazism. Tillich himself was kind of a bohemian theologian influenced by people like Schelling and Heidegger, living in Berlin during the Weimar Republic. And he was deeply disturbed, of course, by the rise of fascism and this kind of blood and soil anti-theology, if you want to call it that, right? That kind of emphasized the crudest forms of human supremacism over what he considered to be issues of much higher concern. And in The Socialist Decision, he makes it very clear that socialism is a modernist doctrine that is an advance in many senses on liberalism, but continuous with it. You can understand why I like Tillich, right? I almost included in my book. But in terms of the kind of property relations that he argues for, he says, look, it's very obvious that God gave the world to human beings in common, and it was intended by God that the earth should work to the benefit of all human beings, not the Volk, certainly, or individual capitalists. And the right way, and this is a very Protestant attitude, to go about distributing property is in a rational way that will be conducive to the benefit of all people without individual egoistic interest interfering with the kind of calculations and evaluations about the best way to basically supply those kinds of flourishing. Now, he doesn't really go into an enormous amount of detail about this in terms of the technical arguments for how to redistribute wealth, because he's a theologian, not an economist or a policymaker. But I think his grounding of this idea in a rationalistic, existential Christian theology, not things that always go well together, but I think Tillich makes it work. And its juxtaposition against these kinds of individualistic chauvinism and nationalist chauvinism is very powerful stuff, because it reminds us of the universality of the human condition and the fact that all human beings share a lot of needs in common, whether it's for food or water or housing or play or friendship, and of course, access to what's of ultimate concern spiritually. And a good society is one that tries to provide that for as many people as possible. So that's Tillich for you. I'll just pause and ask if Tony wants to say anything, and then I can move on to talking a bit about Taylor and MacIntyre if people are interested. Oh, Tony is gone. Ben, you're muted.
All right, we got Tony again.
I don't know what happened there. I just disappeared for a minute. It knocked me out. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Halloween, okay. Satan's interfering with us.
Yeah, there you go. It's the libertarians. Yeah.
There you go. So yes, is there anything you wanted to come in on with what Matt just said about Tillich?
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I'm not, to be totally honest, I'm not that familiar with Tillich and his theology. So I'll go back to Matt on that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, if people are interested, his main work in theology is a big 3-volume set, Christian systematic theology. It's pretty controversial in part because it almost makes a kind of Spinozist argument about the existence of God, right? Suggesting that God can be understood in many different symbolic ways. Christianity, as Tillich thinks, the most appropriate symbolic way of understanding God, but not necessarily the only one. So kind of Spinozist Hegelian in that vein. And some people really like this, other people don't. I tend to think that there's a lot of value to it. But in terms of thinkers that I've talked about more contemporaneously, I'm really attracted to the thinking of people like Charles Taylor and Alasdair MacIntyre, who are broadly speaking usually labeled communitarians, people who argue against atomistic forms of liberal individualism, arguing that a society that's committed to atomistic forms of liberal individualism is one where a lot of people's social needs aren't going to be fulfilled. That includes their economic needs, of course, because of the effects of capitalism, but also includes our need for things like community, right? Non-competitive social relations that are absolutely vital in forming non-alienated relationships with others, friendship, romantic relations, even joining things like hockey clubs, you know what I mean? Or hockey teams, or bowling leagues or whatever it happens to be. Now, Taylor's argument is that we need to understand the dissolution of contemporary community along a number of different ways. One of the reasons why contemporary communities, he thinks, have corroded to the extent they have right now is because of the influence of capitalism and the kind of egoistic individualism that he associates with that. But he also thinks that a complicating factor is the decline of solidaristic religious beliefs. So he points out that in the kind of antiquarian world and through the Middle Ages, most people, the main form of community that they were able to enjoy was, of course, going to things like church, being part of religious organizations and feeling they're part of something bigger than that. Now, if you were to read him just this way, you might think, oh, this is clearly going in a kind of quasi-reactionary but slightly anti-capitalist direction. But what I really like about Taylor is he never goes there. He actually says, look, the reality is that modern ethics are clearly superior to the ethics of pre-modernity. This is a point he makes in Modern Social Imaginaries. There's just a price that you pay for moving towards a modern ethics. So modern ethics is superior to older ethical forms because modern ethics tends to be anti-hierarchical and emphasize that it's as important that somebody in Argentina's life goes well as that my life here in the United States or Canada goes well, which is not the kind of attitude antiquarian thinkers would emphasize. It's this emphasis on my people need to be looked after, and then maybe your people can get a little bit of my sympathy, but not too much, right? Now, the price paid for this, according to Taylor, this kind of universalistic attitude, is actually a feeling of alienation, because since our ethical standards have become so universal and so high that oftentimes we feel that our societies aren't living up to them. And when you accompany that with the feelings of alienation that are induced by things like capitalism, people can feel that the societies they live in are profoundly disappointing in a lot of respects. They're immoral. They're not living up to their own standards. People are hyper competitive, not communal. But his argument is that rather than abandoning a commitment to modernity and embracing return as it was, instead we need to make good the promise of modernity. And he thinks that that's in keeping with the spirit of Christianity and his commitment to things like the dignity of all people, the equality of all in the eyes of God, and the recognition that we share a human nature that warrants expression if we're able to establish the kind of societies that enable our full flourishing. Now, MacIntyre, who is probably the most controversial thinker that I talk about there, is a really complicated guy. And actually, if Tony wants to say anything, then if Tony wants to chime in, I'll save that discussion until afterwards, because that'll take me a while.
Sure. Well, I have a complicated relationship with MacIntyre. I used to be a big fan of his, and I still admire a lot of his thought, especially his communitarian outlook, his diagnosis of emotivism being the main driver of modern ethics. I think there's a lot of validity to that. But where I fundamentally disagree with MacIntyre is on the idea of universal human rights. MacIntyre thinks that they don't exist. He says they're like witches and unicorns. They don't exist. And I think that's just fundamentally wrong. And I think I actually have modern Catholic social teaching on my side on that, because modern Catholic social teaching is very much in favor of universal human rights. I guess it's not too surprising given that Catholic means universal. So yeah, that goes there. So I guess you'd see the kind of the MacIntyrean influence in Catholic social teaching through this principle called integral human development, which is really about the fullest development of the development of the whole person and all people. So it's really the fullest development of a person's capabilities and capacities. So it's a very Aristotelian notion. So it's not just about the material dimension. It's not just about money or goods or wealth. It's about being who you're supposed to be if you develop your capacities. And that's very MacIntyrean. So I think there's a very clear overlap there. That principle, by the way, goes back to Pope Paul VI from 1967. So before MacIntyre was writing After Virtue, I think this was being developed in Catholic social teaching.
Yeah, just to your point about human rights, I'd like to point out that one of the chief drafters and chief intellectual influences on the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was the Catholic thinker Jacques Maritain, right? Well, I always remember from my human rights class because apparently when he was dialoguing with people of different religious faiths and they came up with the draft of the UDHR, he was asked, well, what do you have to say about this? And he was like, all of us agree on the rights that need to be in here, as long as nobody asks why. The kind of reference being, don't ask whether it's grounded in Islam or Judaism or Christianity. Right. We've got a consensus on these things, kind of a Rawlsian overlapping consensus, right? That's enough.
Well, okay. So I do want to get into this though. And then a little later, I want to backtrack to the part about atomistic individualism, but cause this came up a little bit on Twitter, a little while ago. I think when your MacIntyre article was going around about his view on universal human rights.
Yeah.
Because this is there are versions of this view that I think, that you hear every now and again, like that, the idea that there are moral rights or natural rights, human rights, these are not necessarily all synonymous terms by any means, but but the sort of objection is applied to all of them, that there's something sort of innately kind of epistemically suspect about these, that these are spooky entities. And it's never been entirely clear to me why. In other words, if you just want to say that, like, moral norms in general are spooky, then I actually understand, right? I mean, I don't agree with it, but I understand it, right? That say, if you want to just take, I don't know, is it JCC Smart or Mackie or whoever it was, right? Who has I think it's Smart, who, is the thing, from the 50s. It didn't have the other connotation. He called them queer facts, right? That's like what kind of facts are these moral facts supposed to be, right? They seem like very odd facts, right? I can understand that view, right? That, you just take any sort of moral claims and say, okay, well, look, these are claims to truth. What kind of reality is this truth supposed to correspond to? I don't see it. Right. And so you just ended up being some kind of nihilist, or you work your way around to being like a relativist or something. I get it. But I've always been a little bit more confused about the idea that rights, or these specific kinds of rights, were more epistemically problematic than anything else. Right. That's like, why is it, I mean, I understand MacIntyre, isn't a utilitarian, but like, why is it that, that sort of moral facts about, the obligation to maximize utility or whatever should be any, why is that any less prone to this worry, right? Than the view about universal human rights, right? So why are these more like unicorns than say moral virtues or anything else?
I think it's a really tough question to answer, because MacIntyre is not quite a systematic thinker, but there are without a doubt constancies in his work that develop and change over time, and answering it kind of means going back to the beginning and then running through the story, which itself is a very kind of MacIntyrean perspective, right? You have to narrativize everything. So just very, very briefly, right? MacIntyre began his career as, really the only way to describe it is, a kind of odd Christian Marxist. He wrote a minor classic that I recommend everybody read, Marxism and Christianity, that more or less ends with the conclusion that Marxism just is Christianity, except done better, if you want to put it that way. I imagine a lot of people in the chat right now are, shaking their fist at the wall, and that's fine. He intended to be a polemic, but, it has some interesting material in it. By the 1970s, he starts to become a bit dissatisfied with the New Left. You see this in his Marcuse book and some of the more critical works he writes about vulgar Marxism. And of course, like a lot of people, he's just becoming increasingly dissatisfied with real existing socialism. Thinks it's pretty clear that this is leading to, if not a dead end, at least the same kind of dead end as Western modernity. This leads him to write After Virtue, which is without a doubt the book that he's most famous for. And there's a lot of stuff that's packed in there, right? We could spend days and days talking about the text, whether virtue ethics is, worthwhile, and, how it compares to other traditions. Long story short, right? As Tony pointed out, at the core of this book is this very Christian story of decline and fall, if you want to put it that way. As we moved from a kind of Aristotelian Thomistic approach to morality towards a more modern approach to morality that he thinks ends with emotivism, right? The idea that moral preferences are just the same as aesthetic or even culinary preferences about things like ice cream, right? You like murder. I don't like murder. You like vanilla ice cream. I like chocolate ice cream. Maybe our tastes are incompatible with one another. Or I can't even understand your taste, but there's no position from which we can kind of externally criticize one another. Now, like a lot of big picture narratives, the details are very important in the book. And he's a very good moral philosopher, so he understands a lot of the history of this stuff. And I would also say it's very overstated, right? And I think even he came to the conclusion that it was very overstated by the end. When you read MacIntyre circa 2016, he's a lot softer on modern philosophy than he was circa After Virtue, right? But the kind of criticism of universal human rights is because he sees universal human rights, I think falsely again, as a continuance and a kind of byproduct of this Enlightenment transition towards emotivism, where rights are just understood in terms of the kind of legal means through which individuals gratify their individual hedonic urges without any interference from one another. And he really wants to push pretty strongly against that. Now, like Tony, I think that this is really wrong-headed, and I would suggest that actually the later MacIntyre himself seems to have gestured in that direction. Kind of like people like let's just take a contemporary Aristotelian, somebody like Martha Nussbaum, right, who's really shown us how actually if you adopt not necessarily Thomistic, but an Aristotelian anthropology, it's pretty easy to talk about universal human rights because you say human beings just have pretty common non-moral needs, right? Food, shelter, education, and most of us would say that living a flourishing biological life even would require the provision of those things for people. And, we can understand that in rights-based terms. Now, I don't want to get into all the details about that, but like I said, I think MacIntyre starts to gesture a little bit more in that direction. Now, I just want to make one caveat, which is, again, it's very easy to read this story in a reactionary kind of vein, right, in this decline and fall, particularly given the kind of wariness of Marxism that started to develop in the 1970s. But I want to mention that MacIntyre, from the very beginning, always cautioned against that. I should say the beginning of his kind of mature career with After Virtue. He points out that, look, any tradition that becomes Burkean is already dead. There is just no crude going back to St. Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle's if we can just pick up their metaphysics where we left off and carry forward with that. What's needed is a new way forward. And he remained very, very critical of capitalism, saying that this is not, some kind of abnormality that emerges from the Enlightenment, from Enlightenment decay. It's the worst possible expression of Enlightenment decay. And really, capitalism is the political economic system that really induces the widespread adoption of these emotivist ideas. And that's why the book isn't just a kind of text on moral philosophy. The implication is that we're all emotivists now because we approach our morality the same way people approach buying ice cream in a supermarket, because that's what they're used to, right? And by the time you get to his late book, he's very insistent that, and I love this phrase, what Marx taught us, we have been condemned to learn again and again and again and again in his telling. And I think that that's a really true statement.
Yeah, Tony, is there anything you want to throw in on that?
Just very briefly, I mean, Matt mentioned Martha Nussbaum. I think her quite old paper now, The Aristotelian Social Democracy, is an absolute classic.
Yeah.
I think she might have moved away from that a little as the years progressed in a more Rawlsian direction. But I thought that was brilliant. As somebody who likes both Aristotle and considers himself a social democrat, I thought that was great. But can I just mention quickly about, since we're dancing around the idea of human rights, the way, just to explain how Catholic social teaching sees this, because I think this is a very interesting nuance here. If you look at any kind of set of rights that are spelled out, for example, in the Universal Declaration, you will see a kind of a standard way of setting them out. You start off with civil and political rights, then you move down into social and economic and cultural rights, and that's normally the way it's done. Of course, if you're in the US, there's no such thing as economic and social rights. They are like witches and unicorns. They don't exist.
That's not entirely true. There's one economic right that people have, and that's an economic right to private property.
Right to private property. There you go. Yeah, but actually, in Catholic social teaching, the first rights listed are economic rights. This comes back to 1963 to an encyclical called Peace on Earth, Pacem in Terris. It says that, like, the right to life, food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, social protection, these are the primary rights. These come before any other right. They're even listed before civil and political rights, which I always think is fascinating. It's the only place I know that puts economic rights absolutely first, right up front. Like, even the UDHR doesn't do that. So I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, certainly, like, Rawls, who's come up a few times in the discussion, often as a foil for for how to think about Catholic teaching, or the sort of Aristotelian, conceptions of rights and justice. Whereas, I mean, he certainly does believe in, economic rights other than right to property, and certainly, and certainly endorses, redistribution and all of that. But very explicitly, right, the basic liberties come first, right? That's once that has lexical priority, right? Once you've sorted that out, right, then we can start thinking about the economic questions. So I mean, I guess I do wonder though, right? Like I know we have more to do on MacIntyre, and I do want to circle back to that, but like earlier, I think when you were talking about Taylor and MacIntyre, and then Matt, when you were sort of setting up MacIntyre's objection to universal human rights talk, that there was, it said, okay, so his conception is that when we're thinking in this rights language, this is sort of byproduct of this long arc since the Enlightenment of thinking about morality and in terms of how we can pursue our own individual, hedonic needs. And I kind of want to dwell on this, right? This because this is the also the point about atomistic individualism, because depending on the context, right, a lot of people who are watching this might nod along to that or not, right? Like, and this is and certainly if you think about one of so one of Tony's articles, is the Social Democracy and Catholicism article, is in Compact, which no shade on that. Matt and I have appeared there as well, but if you think about the sort of disagreements that I know that like Matt, for example, would have with kind of the dominant editorial line at that magazine, right? I think that this issue of atomistic individualism, or whether rights talk is all kind of about code for people pursuing their own hedonic pleasures, really gets to the heart of it, right? Because the way that somebody like I don't know, frenemy of the show, Sohrab Ahmari would think about
I think he's just every leftist frenemy at this point.
Yeah. There's actually an interview with him in the last print issue of Jacobin called "Conversations with Frenemies." But I don't know if they got that from me or not. But in any case, I haven't said that about 100 times on the show. But like the way he would frame this, or people who might be in some ways more ideologically distant, you think like, I don't know, like Patrick Deneen maybe, right? But he's sort of in the same overlapping circles. They would say, okay, well, look, we have this objection to liberalism, and when we're thinking about neoliberalism, economic individualism, this is just the application to economics of liberalism in general, and you really can't separate any of it, right? Where and because this is all just about this worldview that sees people as atomized individuals, that sort of denies that there are substantive goods that we can know objectively, that that social policy should be aiming at, and says no, just everybody aims at whatever they feel like aiming at, etc. And that economic liberalism, social liberalism, whatever, it's all kind of the same thing, right? Whereas again, Matt, like as I certainly know where you're coming from on this. I mean, you have a book that you'll be back in, I don't know, a month or so to chat about on this show, right? Called Liberal Socialism. So you have a fundamental disagreement about that, and so I guess I'm curious, and then we can maybe hear from Tony on this. But like Matt, to start with you, like how you kind of see right? These figures that you're interested in, like Taylor and MacIntyre. You think they have something to say that's valuable, that's worth engaging with. But I mean, like, certainly the way you've described their views here has more than a little bit of the whiff to it of these kinds of views about liberalism that, I know that you have fundamental disagreements with.
Yeah, by itself, that's actually a very interesting hermeneutic question, because a lot of people have pointed out how early communitarian literature, whether by Taylor or Walzer or MacIntyre, was often criticized for having precisely a whiff of conservatism about it, their own statements notwithstanding. In fact, my former supervisor, I actually made exactly that kind of critique of it. But the way that most communitarians, like Taylor, like Walzer, responded to this was actually just coming out of the closet as liberals later on in life. Left-wing liberals saying, look, what we just wanted was to get away from the more egoistic, pro-capitalist forms of individualism that anybody who's concerned with community and sociality should reject. But things like liberal freedom of the press, freedom of religion, multiculturalism in Taylor's case, all those are things that we want to preserve. On the more, and MacIntyre is a little different here, on the more kind of analytical conclusions that we can reach from this, I think that there are bad kinds of individualism, or sorry, bad kinds of anti-individualism and good kinds of anti-individualism. And the left should be very, very critical of bad kinds of anti-individualism and all for good kinds of anti-individualism. The bad kind of anti-individualism of the sort endorsed by people like, say, Denis, for example, holds with Roger Scruton that, look, individuals are just the product of society. They have very few rights against that society, except those that are well established in tradition. And authority figures get to interpret what that tradition is. And if you don't happen to like the conclusions they reach, well, too bad, right? Your individual interests are superseded by the need to retain national homogeneity, religious homogeneity, whatever, social conservative norms, whatever it happens to be. And for obvious reasons, most of us would push very militantly against that in the name of things like individual rights, individual dignities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Now, the good kind of anti-individualism of the sort that Taylor and MacIntyre were militating against was, again, this criticism of what we might call egoistic hedonism, or the idea that the only thing that really matters is my utility maximization, maybe the utility maximization of my family, and if that's not conducive to the well-being of everyone else, then so be it. And they really wanted to focus on how, ironically, if all you're concerned about as a society is the utility maximization of the individuals, you're not going to end up with a very happy society, because people have this need for sociality, to know that other people around them are doing well if they're fully going to flourish, which, again, I think Marx himself would have readily agreed with, right? When he continuously emphasized, how we are fundamentally Hegelian and Aristotelian beings, and the free development of each is really the only condition for the free development of all. Now, this can seem a little bit abstract, but I think MacIntyre actually gives a really nice example of how to understand this, even though I'm not entirely in agreement with him about the importance of things like tradition for the reasons that you mentioned. So MacIntyre says we need to make this distinction between things that are individually good, publicly good, and things that are of the common, or a common good. So individual goods are things like a nice meal that I might order when I'm, by myself late at night. You know what I mean? A slice of pizza I grab on the way back to the bus, right? Or the sandwich that I get, at the local banh mi place in Ann Arbor, which is pretty good, right?
Are you hungry right now, Matt? There's like three very specific food examples in a row.
Yeah, I'm a little hungry. I haven't had dinner yet, but so okay. Public goods. Public goods are things like swimming pools, schools, the kind of things that we provision together because it is easier to gratify our individual needs through the provision of these public goods than it would be for everybody to just try to provision them independently, right? And MacIntyre is all for that. He says, public good economics is a very good argument for embracing things like universal public health care in every country, because it's way easier to provide universal health care for everybody if everybody pitches into that, organized by the state or through other mechanisms, than everybody trying to pay for it themselves, something that a lot of Americans are reminded of every day, right? But last but not least, he points out that some things are actually common goods, and he points out that these are not actually reducible to public goods, because it's not just something that we all provision together because we all expect to get something from this. A common good is a good that is shared with other people, right? So just to give an example, a food example, it's Canadian Thanksgiving right now. My brother is working really hard to produce a really good turkey for himself and other members of my family. I can't be there with him, but I still celebrate the fact that he seems to have achieved his mission of cooking something that has made people very happy. Even though I don't personally benefit from it in any way, shape, or form. But that's because I have this social tie with him. And to a certain extent, I see his success or free development as a precondition for my own success and free development. And so I relish the fact that he has done good, or he's done well in these regards. And MacIntyre thinks that a commitment to these kinds of common goods, whether on sports teams or in churches or in bowling alleys, a very common American example, is something that we've really lost sight of contemporaneously with our kind of hyper individualistic, hedonistic culture. And he thinks that, atomistic and hedonistic culture, that's something that he wants us to think more seriously about. And I do think that there's a good reason to take seriously this idea of common goods, even though I would stridently, as I mentioned, reject the sometimes traditionalist way that he interprets this, that's excessively hostile to things like individual rights and liberal principles.
Yeah, Tony?
Yeah, so my background is in economics. And as we all know, like neoclassical economics is a very weird discipline. I'm going to use that famous word, weird. It's basically premised on, and this is an unchallenged assumption, you're taught this from day one, and you never get to kind of question any of this. Your goal as a human being is to individually maximize the satisfaction of your subjective material preferences. That's it. That's a bizarre notion of human flourishing. There's no ethical tradition in the world that wouldn't laugh at something like that. No matter what tradition you come from, it will be considered ludicrous. But this is taken dead serious in neoclassical economics. So I think that people like MacIntyre, I think their diagnosis of, say, capitalism, or more specifically, the assumptions that undergird the economy. When I read MacIntyre for the first time, I said, my God, he is attacking neoclassical economics. This is what I see here. And it was stunning to me because I'd never seen anybody do that before. So that was really quite amazing. So that's what I would basically say about that. It's really, I was going to say something else and it's completely slipped my mind. Maybe I'll come back now, but that was my point I wanted to make on neoclassical economics. I did want to make another more flippant comment, and that's like we're skirting around post-liberals like Patrick Deneen.
Yep.
Something that I find utterly bizarre about American post-liberals, not British post-liberals, which are very different, but American post-liberals rallying around a character like Donald Trump, who is a walking, talking embodiment of bundle of autonomous desires. That you can criticize neoliberalism as individualistic and hedonistic and rally around Donald Trump? What the hell is that all about? That to me tells me that their movement is lacking in any seriousness whatsoever.
I would actually say that they get some joy out of that, right? Which itself is a kind of hedonic pleasure. In fact, I don't need to speculate about this. I'll never forget in 2020, the National Review, which for a long time was kind of waving the anti-Trump flag, but gave up on that as soon as it was opportune to do so. They ran a piece called "The Only Middle Finger Available," that basically said, Trump might not do a lot of good for the country. He might be vulgar. Yeah, he might be an immoral person. But boy, does he piss off the liberals a lot. And boy, do I really like that. So yeah, I'm going to give him my vote, right? And that's not even a kind of concession to one's own hedonic impulses. It's a moral concession to the most base, vulgar, resentment-driven hedonic aspirations, right? The desire to stick it to someone else. And I've always found it really laughable, the kind of pretzel-like logic that different Christians will try to use to say, oh, he's just like Darius or just like Xerxes, right? God has a plan for him, even if he's not a particularly good Christian. It's like,
you know, my friend Les was messaging me about this the other day, and he was quoting Dennis Prager saying something along those lines. I was like, wait a second, hold on. If we're going to go with the Darius principle, why are we assuming Trump is God's instrument? It could just as easily be Biden or Harris or whoever, right? I mean, like, you know,
exactly.
You know, I mean, if you know, whatever moral objections you have to these people, I mean, if you're saying, oh, God works through flawed instruments, like, all right, well, why this one, right? Like, how do you pick that? But yeah, I mean, it does.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes God works in mysterious ways, but if he is working through a serial adulterer who assaults women, then boy, oh boy, has God gotten more mysterious than he was when I was growing up, right? A lot more mysterious.
So, I mean, this is certainly the difference, you know, between, you know, like Bush era American conservatism and Trump era American conservatism, that you know, it's you know, a big part of Bush's appeal was that he was, you know, ostentatiously religious, that, you know, he really wore it on his sleeve. They, you know, certainly in terms of the Catholic connection, remember in 2004 there were you know, there were like right-wing bishops who made a big deal of saying that, you know, that John Kerry couldn't take communion because, you know, he supported legal abortion rights. And now, of course, you know, Trump is, you know, despite having appointed the judges who overturned Roe v. Wade, is sort of at least rhetorically flipped hard on that, and actually says that you know, that he wouldn't be in favor of a national abortion ban. That sometimes he even says that he'll protect reproductive rights, and is sort of certainly given a pass for that, right? You know, by anti-abortion conservatives in the great majority of cases. And yeah, I mean, look, he, I mean, I remember when he ran for president the first time in 2016. He was asked what his favorite book was, and you know, that, and he said the Bible, and he was asked what his favorite verse was. He said, well, he couldn't pick, right? It's too many. You know,
2 Corinthians.
Yeah. So he has, you know, I is probably a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, I always say that, you know, that Trump's, you know, evangelical supporters would, you know, would forgive him if he, you know, if he gave a speech in front of an inverted cross in a pool of blood, as long as he triggered the libs in the speech. And that's definitely all true, right? But pretend that they found a vessel for their politics, right? Somebody to rally around that was sort of less absurd as a representative of what they say that they want, as than Donald Trump, you know, that they you know, so you know, even somebody like, you know, I don't know, JD Vance, right, you know, is you know, is somebody who often shows sign of actually caring about ideological things that, you know, that many people in this crowd, you know, say that they care about, right? Let's say it was him. Well, then, you know, then we'd have a more interesting conversation, because instead of just being like, okay, this is just kind of ludicrously, clownishly hypocritical, then you say, okay, well, it wouldn't be necessarily hypocritical anymore, or at least not in the big obvious way that it was before. But now maybe we have a real moral disagreement, because do you think, right, that like the problem with, you know, liberal economics, right, in the neoliberal sense, is that it's a manifestation of larger liberalism, which is bad, because actually public policy should be oriented towards the highest good, and if people don't understand what the highest good is, you know, then it should still be, you know, should still be imposed on them, right? That's one view. Or do you think that at least, you know, even kind of, I mean, I don't disagree with anything that Matt said earlier when he was talking about the sort of like he was carving out space for like good and reasonable critiques of individualism. I think that's all true, but do you basically think that that it's good for people to have fairly wide latitude to pursue their conceptions of the good that they might disagree about among themselves, that in fact part of the point of left economic politics, whether it's social democracy or that we should go further than that, is precisely to give people the economic security so that they can pursue whatever they think of as the good life, and that still seems like a really substantive, important disagreement, right? Like in other words, I mean, certainly putting my own cards on the table here, right? Like if American post liberals were less hypocritical, then I would still think they were wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to say, it's there's a couple of guys from Twitter that I know that have a podcast called "Why Post Liberalism Failed," and what they're doing a great public service, because what they're doing is they're looking back in history to various kind of, well, it's kind of weird to go back to post-liberalism, but you know what I mean, especially with Catholic integralism. They're looking at Franco and Dollfuss and the weirdos in Brazil and Salazar and all these people. And the basic conclusion is these guys were all nuts. They were all crazy. There was no common good here. They were nasty authoritarian regimes who stamped on basic human rights.
So if you hundreds of thousands of people Franco executed, right?
Yeah. Even like the more benign ones, like Salazar, was still a thug. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think there are kind of a few different ways that one can go forward here if one wants to reconcile a kind of left Christianity with liberalism, or if one doesn't want to reconcile left Christianity with liberalism. I think that let's just use Taylor and McIntyre as jumping off points, right? So Taylor very, very clearly wants to reconcile left Christianity with a kind of liberalism. In fact, I would argue very expansive multicultural liberalism. And the way that he tries to do that is by drawing a genealogical link between Christianity and the emergence of the liberal tradition, particularly expressive forms of individualism. Now, Taylor's story about this is very, very complicated, right? I mean, A Secular Age is something like 1,000 pages long, right? Well worth reading if people want to look at it. But to make a very long story very short, he says, look, the reality is that individualism, at least as the West understands it, has deep Christian roots. You can go back and read St. Augustine's Confessions and any other Christian text that talks about how one has become a mystery unto oneself and the kind of interiority that breeds. And Taylor argues that precisely the kind of interiority that Nietzsche talked about and associated with Christianity is at the root of things like Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation, this idea that a person's inner faith and commitment to their faith tradition is the most important thing to them. Obviously, that's going to be conducive to the emergence of very basic liberal principles about this notion that not only is the individual sacrosanct, but the individual living for their belief system has a kind of sacred quality to it. And Taylor argues that in many ways, actually, there's a very good book written by a friend of mine, Galen Watts, The Spiritual Turn, that draws on Taylor. Taylor says, look, there's a very severe criticism right Christians make of the modern world, where they characterize it as increasingly irreligious. But he points out, actually, many people are very religious today. They're just not traditionally religious in the way that we would understand before. Because what people have really done contemporaneously is assimilate insights from a variety of different religious traditions into their own understanding of what faith means to them. Now, you might say that this is less valuable than more traditional forms of faith. But you can't characterize somebody who is spiritual but not religious as an atheist. They're just trying to understand their own spirituality their own way. And Taylor's quite sympathetic to a lot of elements of that, even though he points out that this produces a lot of silly faith traditions, the kind of people who are like, these quantum crystals will save me from, Bagul when he comes along or whatever it happens to be, but not really any sillier than certain things are consigned into more idiosyncratic versions of Christianity. Counteractingly, you have people like MacIntyre, who I think is the most honest of these figures. So we'll just keep going back to him. Now, one of the things that MacIntyre points out that people like Deneen and Vermeulen just ignore is MacIntyre says, look, the old Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics upon which Aristotelian and Thomistic ethics was predicated is just not going to fly any longer, right? We've understood that since at least the scientific revolution. Any effort to kind of resuscitate the ethics by just going back to the metaphysics is really just a kind of cop-out, right? You're going to act like Descartes, Galileo, Newton, none of them ever existed, right? So we need to find a way to ground this on a more modern, materialistic kind of metaphysical basis, which is going to mean giving up a lot of these philosophical views that many right-wing Catholics consider to be extremely important. And one of the things that I find problematic about people like Deneen and Vermeulen is they just never bother with any of that. They're like, modern morality is bad, back to Aristotle, back to Thomas Aquinas. We can't defend those metaphysical views. Well, they work well enough. And, once we banish Kant and Mill from the curriculum, it won't be a problem any longer, right? So MacIntyre's argument is that he has a number of different variations of this. Sometimes he argues that we can go back to understanding traditions immanently and recognize that a kind of telos is ascribed to our activities that we engage in communally, right? Like the telos of playing baseball is to play a good baseball game, and we flourish the better we play that baseball game, right? But that's not some kind of natural inscribed teleology in the sport itself, right? It's not like God has come down from on high and said, play a good baseball game. This is set by human traditions. It's a game that we know how to play, but we still get a lot of benefit from playing it well and learning how to play it better and better and better. More recently, I think that actually MacIntyre has taken the right move in this direction, which is to draw more heavily on people like Marx, to argue again from an Aristotelian Marxist standpoint that there are just clearly certain kinds of non-moral human goods that are common to everybody, right? This need for housing, this need for food, this need for company, etc. What again, Martha Nussbaum will call these kind of basic human capabilities that can be realized. And he says that trying to give people the opportunity to develop those through establishing the right kind of cooperative society will be conducive to human flourishing. Although I'd like to point out, even he seems to be, again, more generous to liberalism than he was circa After Virtue, because his last big book, Ethics in the Catholic Modernity, spends a lot of time writing very admiringly about bohemian decadence. You wouldn't think that a Catholic conservative would have a lot of sympathy for. People like D.H. Lawrence, who famously slept his way around Europe. But MacIntyre says a good society committed to tradition needs to have traditions that are sufficiently robust to create space for a large number of different people. In fact, if you don't have a tradition that creates a large number of different people, it's probably not a very healthy tradition. And it's very hard for me to think about something like that without seeing it as a commitment to, if not political liberalism, at least a kind of liberal attitude in the more Catholic sense, right? That a liberal being somebody who just likes human diversity, likes human experiments, likes the different kinds of forms of life that people can assume, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is, maybe as we get into the last portion of this, be interesting to think a little bit more broadly about the stakes of this, right? So I think that, obviously, in fact, one of the first things Tony said at the beginning, when he was kind of describing the history of Catholic social teaching, is about the ways in which at various times and places, the church's position was like arch reactionary, right? Against the French Revolution, against the revolutions of 1848. I don't think, I don't think the worst, modern manifestations of that are probably unknown to anybody, watching this, right? It's in terms of the sort of worst of the church's, like history on relationship to, fascist movements in Europe and so on, right? But but I guess what interests me about this is that, you know, above and beyond the fact that the sort of, you know, current manifestation, Francis, et cetera, is happily much better than that, is also just that, you know, if we're talking about a tradition, right, you know, intellectual resources here that people could draw on, that, you know, you certainly have the capacity for better than that, and this is. And I mean, maybe in a way, I mean, right, this takes us back to what I was mentioning earlier about, you know, that Michael Brooks view about cosmopolitan socialism, because you know, I think that if you want to achieve at the very least, you know, social democracy, right? You know, Tony said earlier that, you know, in America, in a certain sense, economic rights are like witches and unicorns. You know, that the sort of given the dismal place that we're starting out in. So at the very least, you want to rebuild the labor movement. You want to achieve universal health care, and you know, and obviously, some of us would have, you know, horizons that are much more radical than that. That's really hard, right? I mean, you know, you have to, you know, we're talking about a long-term agenda to overcome tremendous vested interests that, you know, stand in the way of doing any of those things, right? And so it seems to me that there's no way to have a successful movement like that doesn't include lots of participants with lots of different worldviews who draw those worldviews to support that, right? Like it's, and you know, kind of saying, oh, well, you know, there are all these sort of reactionary moments in the history of this doesn't tell me very much, right? It reminds me a little bit of, you know, arguing with new atheist types in the late 2000s who were like huge war on terror hawks, you know, who would say, oh, well, actually the ultimate problem is that, you know, Islam is violent and horrible. And, you know, it says this and that in the hadiths. And I would always say, okay, but like, what's your plan here? You know, is there something you think you can do that's just going to make Islam not exist anymore? I mean, this is a major world religion, you know, it's like 1 billion adherents, you know, it's not going anywhere, right? So you'd better hope that there's a better interpretation of it, that you know, people can draw on to, you know, to come to conclusions that are more congenial to you. And I'd make sort of approximately parallel points here, right? You know, that you know, Catholicism and other forms of Christianity, I mean, have you know, the adherence to one degree or another, right, of a giant portion of the population of the planet. So I mean, if you want to accomplish massive things in reordering, you know, the economic reality around us, I mean, I think the plan better not be to convince everybody to be a, you know, atheistic historical materialist first, and then you can do all that stuff, right? You know, after everybody's been brought around. That doesn't sound very realistic to me, right? So you know, I guess I wonder if maybe a place to kind of start to bring the conversation to a close is talk about, Tony, your article in Commonweal, the theology of social democracy, right? You know, so how do you see that, right? You know, the sort of this theologically informed way of thinking about, you know, sort of striving for achieving some of these economic rights. How would you conceptualize that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we need kind of a broad-based movement that has secular liberals, socialists, people from the different religious traditions, not just Catholicism, but you know, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, all these different traditions, because they all have so much depth and wisdom to say. But I think, you know, on the economic stuff, there are a number of things we can say about where we can kind of reach kind of a consensus. One is obviously to provide people with these basic economic rights to allow them to develop their capacities and to flourish and as full human beings. I think another part of it is to bolster the labor movement. I'm saying nothing here that's going to be a surprise to anybody, but you know, a very interesting aspect of Catholic social teaching, which nobody ever talks about, including some people in Catholic social teaching, is the idea of workplace democracy, and the notion that you want workers not only to have unions and get decent wages and good stuff like that, but you also want them to share in the management and ownership of the enterprise itself. You want profit sharing, you want co-determination, you want all this stuff. This comes out of the European tradition of Christian democracy in countries like Germany, France, and Italy. It's completely unknown in the US. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren have tried to raise some of these issues. I think people just didn't really pay much attention to it. Unfortunately, it's written off as socialist. You remember the time that one of the German car companies, I can't remember which one it was, maybe Volkswagen, when it was in one of these southern right to work states, basically came along and says, well, we're going to set up a works council because every German factory has works councils and that's how we do things. And there was complete war. The local Republican politicians were saying, this is corporate socialism, this is a disgrace. And the German company was like, are you kidding me? This is like what we do in every German company. So I think these are the kind of issues that I think in terms of how you would move forward, stuff like this. Just mentioning some things that I think don't get much attention here. Certainly Kamala Harris is saying nothing about anything like this. And even Bernie has not really talked about it in quite a number of years.
I think I'll end by moving from the personal to the political. I'll be a good feminist tonight, right? So I was raised Roman Catholic, pretty conservative town. Our member of parliament is Pierre Poilievre, who's probably going to be the next prime minister, and deeply disappointed in that, right? And one of the reasons I left the Catholic Church wasn't because I had lost an interest in spiritual issues. That's never gone away. It was because most of the conservative Catholics that I talked to when you would bring up things like, well, what about, this verse in the Bible that says it's harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than it is for, a camel to cross the eye of the needle. Well, that was always meant to be interpreted metaphorically or allegorically or analogically. There were a lot of different explanations, but the stuff about, bashing homosexuals, that was really, really important. And everybody, when they're on their way to the golf course, would tell me that's what Catholicism is really about, right? The stuff about the poor, it's nice. If you can go about doing it, feel free to do so, but no obligation. But bashing the gays, got to get around to that. And what has profoundly disturbed me about post-liberalism is how many Catholics, in the name of preserving their faith tradition, have decided to double down on what I think are the most crass, venal, and frankly worldly iterations of the faith tradition. And in my own experience, these kinds of encounters led me to the conclusion that a lot of what passes for Christianity is closer to what Kierkegaard famously described as Christendom, right? It's a kind of compromised Christianity that appeals to religious sensibilities, not because it wants to ethically or spiritually motivate people to do something that is hard but worthwhile, but instead to conciliate people to the world as it is, to conciliate people to their nations as they exist, and of course to preserve conservative systems of power by propping them up ideologically. And to go back to MacIntyre, anybody who is defending Christendom in this sense deserves the full force of the Marxist critique of religion, right? This idea that it's just the opiate of the masses. It's designed to reduce religion down to mammon, and it serves really no spiritually higher function. But what I do think that we could do is actually say, if you take the ethical tradition of any religious outlook seriously, rather than focusing on the more vulgar, power reinforcing iterations of it, why not talk about ways to redistribute power and to genuinely try to create a world where the least among us will be treated as first. And even though I would understand that outlook differently now in more Rawlsian terms, right? Take care of the least well off, etc. I do think that is very much in sequence with the best ethics in the Christian tradition. And it's what I'd like to see a kind of left Christianity take far more seriously in the future. And it sounds to me like that's what Tony is arguing for, which is why I've always enjoyed our discussions, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what he produces in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys. Really enjoyed this. We have links in the description to one each of the Matt and Tony articles that we referred to in today's discussion. So I would really urge people to check those out. I think both of these guys are well worth listening to. Matt, we'll see you in next month, I think, when you're back on to talk about the liberal socialism book. And Tony, let's make sure to do this again sometime soon. And with that, I am going to go to the post game with Jake and Andy. If you're a patron, you should already have that link. If you are not, that is patreon.com/Ben Burgess. So go check that out. Talk to you guys soon. Matt, get something to eat. Left is best.
Left is